Camera settings, exposure values. It's not something that I generally like to talk about in all of my different tutorial videos, and I'm going to explain why that is. I'm also going to do a few experiments to see what kind of exposure values you can expect when using Adaptalux lighting. Stick around and I'll explain more in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux, and yes, today we are delving deep into camera settings and exposure values. Now, this is something that I don't generally like to talk about in my tutorial videos, and you might think that's a little bit weird. Why don't you describe your settings when you're taking your photographs? And the simple answer to that is that I don't like to be too prescriptive. I don't think it's generally that helpful for beginners, and experts obviously are going to know their settings inside out anyway. Now, the reason that I don't think it's particularly helpful for beginners is because every different scenario is going to have so many different variables. It's actually very, very rare that you're going to be able to put the settings into your camera the way that I describe them and get the same results. So if I'm sat here saying, well, to get this shot, you just need to set 1/100th on your camera and ISO 400 and shoot at f8. Well, if you go and do that and your lighting is slightly wrong, or your subject is a little bit further away or a little bit darker, or maybe there's less ambient light in your room, well, you're going to get a completely different photograph and you're going to come back to me saying, why didn't it work? Well, I'm going to go through a few different variables and we can do some experiments, and hopefully by this end of this video, you'll be able to take a look at your shots and figure out how to get the best settings all by yourself. So the first thing that I'm going to do is get my camera out and grab a little tool that's going to be helpful for these experiments. The tool that I'm using today is a set of these 3 cards. Now they come on a nice little lanyard so that you can carry them around in your bag, and they're very, very helpful. We've got a pure white, a pure black, and this grey card. Now, a grey card might be something that you've heard of before, and it is the one that we're interested in today. And it's this particular shade of grey that is important. You might hear it called a balancing card, or 18% grey, or a mid-level grey, but this is a grey card that is used predominantly for setting your white balance. You can hold this up in one of your images, and then your photo editing software later, you can sample that grey as a pure mid-tone of grey, so that when your light is casting strange temperatures of light across your image, you can compensate for that by saying, this is a mid-level grey. Make this grey the particular grey that it should be. And because this grey is a standard grey across all grey cards, any video editing or photo editing software worth its salt is going to know to try and make this the correct grey. So that's one use for it, probably the most common use, but we can also use these for testing our exposure. This grey is also the same grey that our camera is trying to expose for. When your camera is metering and deciding how much light is in your image and what exposure values to choose, it's trying to average out the whole exposure of the image down to this mid-level grey. It's going to try and get as much of your image as close to this grey as possible. Now, obviously for a normal scene, that's impossible. The camera is never going to be able to average everything out, but it's going to try and take the brights and the darks and average them down to as close to this color as we can get. So if we put this color down in front of our camera and then light it, we should get some pretty accurate exposure values for our lighting. That's exactly what I'm going to be doing today to test the amount of light coming out of the Adaptalux Studio, and on average, what kind of settings you can expect. That was quite a lot of information, but all you need to know really is that we're using this grey card as a stand-in for a subject today. If I were to use a different subject, a normal one like a flower or a coin for instance, that would be an additional variable for our tests. So maybe my coin is slightly shinier than your coins, or maybe my flower is slightly brighter or slightly lighter, in which case that would affect the kinds of exposure values that you could expect for your subject. We're also going to be shooting at a particular angle, a particular distance, and with a particular set of lighting arms. that means that you should be able to recreate this exact scenario at home should you wish to, and test whether or not these exposure values are what you're getting as well. So if you found this video and you've seen our channel before, you're probably familiar with the Adaptalux Studio. This is our lighting that we're going to be testing with today. And if you've not seen it, this is a piece of lighting equipment designed for macro photography. It's very precise and it's magnetically modular, so you can just plug in various flexible lighting arms into the control pod here, and you can place these around wherever you need them to be to light up your subjects. Now this has got a built-in battery, it's got manual controls of all of the different lights. You can have 5 lights at once, and it's also got Bluetooth control. So there's a huge amount of control over your light that we can exert onto our subject. Now all of that is another variable. Placing our light in different places, changing the brightnesses of those lights, and even changing the lighting arms themselves are all going to change the exposure values that our camera wants to try and choose. So I'm going to be playing around with a few of those. The combinations are actually pretty endless, so we can't go through every particular scenario, but I will go through some of the most common things that people like to do with their lighting and see if we can't get some nice average expected exposure values. So I've told you about my grey card and my lighting. Now let's talk about the camera setting and the methodology for testing this lighting. So the camera is set up facing downwards onto my grey card, which is sat down here, and my camera is, let's have a little measure, it's about 17 inches or 44 centimeters. That's to the very front of the camera, so I'm not including the lens here. The reason I'm not including my lens is measuring to the front of the lens adds another variable. Your lens might be shorter or longer, it might be a different magnification, but essentially the distance between the front of my camera body to the grey card is 44 centimeters. The distance that my lighting is currently sat is also going to be measured, and I'll be changing that round as I go. So from the center of the grey card to the end of the lighting arm is roughly 6 centimeters currently. I'll be updating that as it goes along, and I'll be reading out the exposure values that we're getting with these various different lighting arm setups. Now, one of the biggest things that the Adaptalux Studio is fantastic for is getting light really close down onto your subject. So taking a look through the camera, you can see that we're nice and close into this grey card, not quite close enough to eliminate everything around the edges, and of course there's a lighting arm in frame as well. So my camera will be set to spot metering. That means that my camera, for its exposure calculations, is only going to look right in the center of the frame, right in the middle of this grey card. That means that we don't have to be too accurate with the balance of our lighting from multiple directions, and we don't have to worry about all of this excess stuff around the outside of the frame. This white table is obviously going to reflect a lot more light. That's not going to factor into our calculations. It's only taking a look at the very center of that grey card, which is ideal for testing purposes. This means that we can test all sorts of different lighting arms, single lighting arms, multiple lighting arms, and diffusion, and we can get our lighting arms nice and close and of course move them away as well. So in brief, my methodology is to leave everything the same. We're keeping our subject the same, this grey card. We're keeping the distance the camera is set. That's going to stay the same. And we're just going to be reading the exposure values that the camera decides for itself. The variable that I'm changing is the lighting. We'll be changing the intensities of the light by changing the lighting arms and their brightnesses. We'll be changing the distance that the light is away from our subject, and we'll be adding some diffusion and some filters, all to see how that affects our settings. Now, if this raises more questions than it answers for you, do let me know down in the comment section. We'll try to clear everything up as much as possible. That is the purpose of this video in the first place, because these are not uncommon questions that we get asked. What kind of settings can I expect, and what happens if I do X, Y, and Z with my lighting? So let's get started by testing the most simple Adaptalux setup, a single white lighting arm undiffused. So hopefully you can see all of the settings on the back of my camera here. We've got my shutter speed over here. This is the number that's going to change. My camera is going to affect this the most because my ISO is currently set at 400 and my aperture is set on the lens ring on the front here, that's set to 5.6. So we've got set aperture 5.6, we've got 400 on the ISO, and my shutter speed is currently at 1/400th of a second. That is with a single white lighting arm plugged in at 50% brightness with boost mode turned on. And that arm is roughly, I think I said 6 centimeters, didn't I? Yeah, so roughly 6 centimeters away from the center of the card. So if you place your white lighting arm at 6 centimeters away from your subject, you should be expecting a similar sort of exposure value at the point of focus for your light. Obviously, if you're exposing for this area over here, it'll be a little bit less. And if you change the distance that your lighting arm is from your subject, it's going to change quite rapidly. Let's do that just as a demonstration. I'll move my lighting arm further away and you'll be able to see that shutter speed dropping as my light gets further and further from the subject. Now this is something called the inverse square law. The further your lighting is from your camera, essentially the worse settings you're going to get. Now I've just moved my lighting arm from 6 centimeters away to about 14 centimeters away. So we've over doubled the distance away from our grey card, and you can see that my exposure has now fallen to 1/100th of a second in the shutter speed, and the ISO and aperture has stayed the same. So the next thing that I want to test with my single white lighting arm setup at 50% brightness with boost mode on at 14 centimeters away. You can see where all of these variables start coming in because every single one of those is a variable, but I'll try and keep that as consistent as I can. But I'm just going to add a diffuser. Now it's really easy to add diffusers to the Adaptalux Studio. They're just magnetic, they clip onto the ends of lighting arms, and we have 3 grades of diffuser. So we have 30%, 50% and 70% diffusion in grade 1, 2 and 3 respectively. So to tell which grade of diffuser you have, you need to look at the notches here on the little metal piece of your diffuser. You've got 2 notches, means you've got a grade 2 diffuser, which is 50% diffusion. If you've got an older diffuser, the notches look more like this. They've got little bits cut out of them, whereas there's lines on the newer ones. So I'm going to test this 50% diffuser, grade 2 diffuser on my white lighting arm setup and see what difference that makes to our settings. So clipping my diffuser onto the end of my lighting arm here, you can actually see that the diffuser is now in frame, and therefore my shutter speed is skyrocketed. That's not what we want. So I'm going to move this just out of frame a little bit so it's back onto that center spot metering of the grey card, and I'm just going to measure my distance again and try and get it so that we're at 14 centimeters away. So the lighting arm itself, the source of the light, is still at 14 centimeters away, and the diffuser itself is about 5 centimeters long. So we've added 5 centimeters to the end of our lighting arm, but the source is still 14 centimeters away. The result of that is that you can see that my shutter speed has dropped to 1/40th of a second. That's a significant drop, but my light is now much more pleasant, nice and diffused. You can see that those shadows on my finger are not quite as harsh. So hopefully from our single lighting arm demonstration, you can tell that the biggest factor on your settings here is how far away that light is from your subject. It goes with the inverse square law again, because you're measuring the distance that the light has to travel overall. So the light actually has to come from the lighting arm and then bounce off your subject and then up to your camera. So you can either reduce the distance from your subject to your camera, or you can reduce the subject distance from the lighting. So bringing the lighting closer is going to increase your settings. It's going to make everything a little bit brighter. You saw that when we went from 6 centimeters away at 1/400th of a second up to 14 centimeters away, we dropped to 1/100th of a second. And then when we added that diffuser, it dropped down again. You'll see that that is a constant throughout all of these demos. The closer our light is, the better. So if you want better settings, the easiest and quickest thing to do is try and move your lighting as close as possible. Now this doesn't work for every subject, but it's a good rule of thumb, especially with something like the Adaptalux Studio. Our light sources are teeny tiny. They're designed to be as close to the subject as possible. It's no good having a macro subject this big and then putting your lighting all the way over here when you could have it right here and get much better settings. So let's move to a few different lighting arms. First of all, I want to do that same test, but with a Lighting Arm-S, the brighter version of the normal white lighting arm. So I've changed my normal white lighting arm out for a Lighting Arm-S. This is still at 6 centimeters away from the center of my grey card, but you'll notice that the difference here is not just that it's brighter, it's actually got a much narrower beam angle as well. That spotlight on the grey card is much narrower, and although we are only measuring the very center of the image, the extremes out here on the sides are much darker. So this is going to be much better for smaller subjects. You'll get much better settings if your subject is really tiny and can fit within this beam. However, it's not going to have the same versatility as the normal white lighting arm. Now let's do the same as we did a moment ago and move this Lighting Arm-S further away from our subject. Let's try and get it as close to 14 centimeters again as we were. So that's 14 centimeters, and you can see that we've again dropped down to 1/400th of a second. That's where we started at last time. So we've moved our Lighting Arm-S away, but we're still getting much better settings than the normal white lighting arm on its own. The last thing that we need to do is add our level 2 diffuser to our Lighting Arm-S, and you can see that we've all dropped down again to 1/80th of a second. So moving your Lighting Arm-S further back and diffusing it is going to reduce the impact that that brighter arm actually has. It's still going to direct a little bit more light forwards, but the focused nature of the light is going to be diminished by diffusing it, by moving it further away. The takeaway from that is that if you've got a smaller subject, you're going to be much better off with the Lighting Arm-S if all you care about is your settings. So we've moved on once again. I've now got 2 white Lighting Arm-S's plugged in at once, pointed down at that same spot. They're still on 50% brightness with boost mode turned on. That exposure has changed again. We're now looking at 1/2000th of a second, ISO 400, and we're still at f5.6. Now do remember that I'm not recommending that you go shooting at 1/2000th of a second all of the time. This is just a flat example. You might want to trade off some of that shutter speed for maybe a lower ISO or a higher f number. That's up to you, but this is just our benchmark. So I'm going to do this now again by moving my Lighting Arm-S's further away. So as you can see, moving those arms away from my, my subject once again, my shutter speed has dropped down to 1/500th of a second, which is only slightly better than we were getting with a single arm. So you can see that we're maybe getting some diminishing returns here with these Arm-S's when we're not making use of that focal point of the light, which is very close to the ends of the arms. I'm going to diffuse both of these with level 2 diffusers, and we'll see what happens there. So with both of my white Lighting Arm-S's diffused, you can see that we're back down to 1/100th of a second. Now obviously the biggest difference there is that we've moved our lighting back, but adding that diffusion has definitely taken a lot of light away as well. So the takeaway from that might be that if you want to diffuse your light, you want to move that light as close as possible. That becomes even more important when you're sacrificing a little bit of light for a little bit of diffusion. So far, I've only been shooting with all of my lighting arms set to 50% brightness in the pod. That's a good way to test all of this because that's the default setting that they turn on when you plug a lighting arm into the pod. I have had boost mode on though, so that's a big factor in how bright my arms are. If you turn boost mode off, it will save a lot of battery, but generally you want to be shooting with that on if you want the best settings. I always shoot with boost mode on, even though it does drain my battery a little bit faster. I do want to experiment with another white Lighting Arm-S, and I do want to turn them all up to 100% just to see how high I can get that shutter speed to go. So I'm going to be shooting with 3 white Lighting Arm-S's at 6 centimeters away each, 100% brightness with boost mode on. Let's see what that does to our shutter speed. Okay, so you can see that I'm now at 1/6400th of a second, still with my ISO at 400 and f5.6, but that's with 3 white lighting Arm-S's pointed down at that spot in the middle there. Now, this doesn't seem that dramatic because my camera is adjusting for all of these changes and exposures. So even if I unplug 2 of these arms, it will actually adjust and try and look the same. But you need to look at that number. We've just dropped, taking 2 of those arms out, back down to 1/2000th of a second or 1/1600th, depending on the exact position of my card here, I guess. Perhaps my arm's not quite in position, but you can see that just tiny little changes of the lighting makes a big difference. Hopefully those few tests with 1 white lighting arm and then a lighting Arm-S and then 2 lighting Arm-S's and eventually 3 lighting Arm-S's with everything turned up to max gives you a good idea of what kind of settings you can actually get from the Adaptalux Studio in various different configurations. Now, depending on which lighting arms you have, you should be able to extrapolate from that a little bit, and it should just give you a general idea of what kind of settings you can expect at various distances away from your subject. Obviously, if you're shooting with different arms and different amounts and different brightness settings, all of that is going to change, but hopefully it's a good benchmark. Now, I did mention that we can't test every single combination. There's just not enough time in the world. We'd be here for weeks doing that. But I do want to test one last thing, and that is a little bit of color. We do have color filters and colored lighting arms. So these are going to have an interesting effect. I'm not quite sure how they're going to interact with my gray card or whether my camera is going to try and compensate strangely for them. I would imagine that they're going to take out considerably more light than the plain white diffusers, and the green lighting arm I'm really not sure what's going to do, but let's take a look at the settings anyway so you can see what kind of settings you can expect with a little bit of color. So here we are with a single white lighting arm. We're back to the original setup that we had, but this time we've got a blue color filter on there instead of a level 2 diffuser, and you can see that we've got 1/30th of a second here. So if I change this out back to the level 2 diffuser, you can see that it does take out slightly more light, but it does give you that nice little blue tinge on the card there, so you can make use of that without losing too much light. Now let's take a look at some colored lighting arms. So back at our 6cm mark with our green lighting arm, you can see that we're getting 1/200th of a second. And if I move that green lighting arm away back up to our 14cm mark, we're down to 1/60th of a second with our green. Now, I'm not too clued up on my color theory to know how this green is actually affecting my gray card, but as far as I know, it shouldn't be affecting it all too much, that the fact it's colored. It's just the strength of the light itself, because the camera is not looking at color for this exposure value. At least that's my understanding of it. If you've got a different understanding, please do educate me down in the comments. So if you've got to this point and you're thinking, this was super boring, well, I tend to agree with you actually, because it's not something that I generally like to talk about. For that reason, most people aren't interested in the specifics of how a photograph was taken, because it's going to be different for you anyway, unless you're being really, really precise with your settings, in which case you already know what settings are going to work for you. Hopefully this has given you a little bit of information about how our lighting works though. For those of you that have questions about how bright the lights are, what difference the diffusion makes, and how far you should be putting your lights away from your subject, this should give you a good idea. I'm also going to pair this with a blog post on our website, which I'll link down below, and on that blog post I'll put a series of images that I've taken over the years with the settings that they were taken at, so that you can go and have a look at the kinds of settings I'm generally using to get the images that I get. Now, I do need to leave you with a final caveat in that you won't get those same settings unless you're in the exact same environment that I'm in, using the exact same amount of lighting arms at the same settings with the same lens and the exact same subject. So do bear all of that in mind when you're choosing your own settings. However, hopefully this has been helpful to some of you, and let me know down in the comments if you did find it interesting and helpful. For now, that is all that I've got time for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.